Welcome everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are participating with us to our Blending Ecology and Landscape Design webinar hosted by the Nordic brand. We are still getting people to come on, and but we're going to get started since we're a couple of minutes after 8 here in Chicago. So I am your moderator host, and I'm Krista Oram-Keller. I'm chairman and president of Midwest Ground Covers and chairman of Midwest Trading. We're located in Illinois, about an hour west of Chicago. And I'm also one of the board members of the A-Plant 2000 group, which is the nursery partnership group that owns the Nordic brand. I've grown up in our nursery and in the landscape industry, and I have my undergraduate degree in landscape architecture and have worked at the Midwest companies for over 20 years. So before we begin, just a couple of things, housekeeping things about the webinar. Since it is a webinar, your camera and your microphone have been disabled. And the way that you communicate with us as we go is to type questions in the Q&A box, and we're going to try to actively address those comments or questions as we go instead of waiting till the end of the session. So please feel free to type in your questions, and we can welcome them. Although the webinar will be in English primarily, we can welcome them in Danish if that's more comfortable for you to write in. After the session, for those who are landscape architects in the United States, there will be an email that comes with your quick quiz to get your continuing education credit for your licensure. So you can look for that as a separate email, which will come. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our Midwest Ground Covers YouTube channel within the next couple of weeks. So if you miss a portion or have to walk away, you can come back and listen later. And at the very end, we have some exciting prizes if you'll take our survey and give us a little bit of feedback. For both Europe and for North America, we have some Nordic plants that we'd like to share with you. And for those in North America, we have a couple of really exciting books as giveaways. So be sure to fill out the survey. You'll be in that will put you into a quick little raffle, and we'll have a couple of winners for some free plants, plant samples, and books for those in North America. And because it seems like this hour goes so quickly and there's always more to ask about and we can't get to all the questions, we've added an extra 15 minutes today. So if you'd like to stay after we close the formal webinar just for extra conversation, it's kind of like if you're at a presentation in person, some people like to go up and talk to the speakers at the end. We will stay on for an extra 15 minutes after the hour closes. So simply, if you'd like to enjoy that part, just stay on. And you can add some more questions into the Q&A section. So we want to welcome everyone, and we're really excited to have, we're almost at 200 participants now, and very excited to have all of you. Welcome. Just a quick bit of information about what Nordic is. So A-Plant is an international nursery partnership, and most of the nurseries are in Denmark. We have Nandina, which was a founding member. We have Hortus Advising, which is a horticulture advising firm. Birkholm Nursery, Nygaard's Planteskole, and we have Midwest Ground Covers here in Illinois in North America. And we have, I think it's about 10 partner nurseries and growers that are associates that participate in the A-Plant and support the Nordic brand. The Nordic brand was trademarked in 2015, and we have over 50 plants in our collection. And if you'd like to learn more specifically about Nordic, you can go to the website here. We have more plants on the market in the European market, a bit fewer here in North America, but we're continuing to collaborate and work on that. And our vision for today really came from some of our Nordic group getting together, our A-Plant group getting together last fall for a plant excursion and plant learning trip. And we talked about many interesting topics as we were together. So the concept is really that this webinar and the previous one are hosted by Nordic, and our intention is to create an interesting and engaging dialogue to bring diverse green industry professionals together for some maybe debate and challenging topics, and to really focus on challenging topics that don't have black and white answers, don't have easy answers or easy solutions, to really make it more of an interesting conversation and try and share some of what we experience together with you. And in this particular session, our aim is to address what does it mean to blend ecology and landscape design, so sort of the natural landscape with the constructed or designed landscape, and to talk about the intersection of nature and aesthetics in design spaces. And within those comments, we already could jump into some exciting conversations. Just a quick follow-up, we did have a session, Nordic webinar in January, and we wanted to follow up on some of the comments that were made after that session. There were questions about and comments about plants, an interest in learning more about the Nordic branded plants, maybe those in Europe and those in North America. There were questions and comments and curiosity around testing. How are we testing plants in Europe and in North America? Concerns about invasive plants, particularly in North America, and their relation to pollinators. And there was also interest in talking about durable versus native and having further conversation. And there are, of course, differences in the interests of our audience and the needs and plants for each region. So we're thinking about continuing these Nordic-sponsored conversations and webinars to continue talking about some of these topics. And at the end, when we go to the survey, we're interested to know what's important to each of you. What would you like to explore further? So kind of vote for what you think is most interesting. And we're also interested to know whether you like the conversation across the Atlantic, where we have some diverse opinions, or would you like more conversation that's just focused on your region? So give us some feedback at the end of the session, and we'll look at what can we do in the future. So starting off, just these are a couple of visuals, a Danish magazine and Illinois magazine from the Landscape Contractors Association. And why did we focus on this topic? It was one that has come up in our conversations, but also here we are talking about things like lower maintenance and gravel gardens and using native plants. And on the left there in the circle, naturalistics or wild style gardens in Denmark as well. So we are noticing topics that were interesting in both continents and thought, let's bring that together for the conversation. So I'd like to introduce our panelists and welcome all four of you, and thank you ahead of time for your participation. First up, we have Austin Eischeid, and Austin is from Austin Eischeid Garden Design based in Chicago. He focuses on naturalistic planting design for both commercial as well as residential and public spaces. He's done a number of gardens here at Midwest and in Chicago at Millennium Park. And he collaborates on projects with contractors and landscape architects throughout the United States. Welcome, Austin. And we have Jensen from Jensen Ecology. He's based in Madison, Wisconsin. He works on projects throughout the Midwest, ranging in size from less than an acre and up to thousands of acres. And in fact, he's also helped us here at Midwest. And you may have seen him in his and Austin's collaboration about our gardens at Midwest Natural Garden. And he works from the design aspect, permitting, planning, and all the way through implementation and site management. So welcome, Jens. And we have Katrine Turner. She's founder and co-owner of Vejsnaes, located in Fredericia, Denmark. She's a biologist, a designer, consultant, a teacher, course developer, and lecturer. And she's a pleasure to have dialogue about all those topics on. And she works both from the theoretical and practice side of design and in creating urban nature. I really like that term, Katrine. Welcome. And we have Thomas Vejsnaes, who was with us last time. Thomas is a landscape architect and a plant specialist working at the internationally renowned nature-based design studio SLA, where he's heading the planting research group. He's a guest lecturer in botany for landscape architects at the University of Copenhagen, as well as a lecturer on planting design, and he writes articles for the Danish Horticultural Society. He's passionate about finding creative solutions for how we tie our cities together, and he specializes in climate adaptation, project planning, and green space development. So welcome, Thomas. So with that, we are going to start with our audience of now over 200. Welcome to those who have come in the last few minutes. With a quick poll to get some information from all of you. So where do you fall in terms of designing your projects with ecology in mind? Thinking that on one side we have highly ecologically minded focus where aesthetics are less relevant, all the way to complete focus on the aesthetic side. Yes. All right, so that's interesting. So we're kind of in the middle, it looks like, half and half. Very, very interesting. Excellent. And then I think we have 2 more questions for you. So do you have your own personal definition of blending ecology with landscape design? Yes or no? Or maybe you don't know? Excellent. That's interesting. So most people do. And then our last question here. We're taking a stab here at, if you answered yes, which one of these most closely matches your definition? A place-driven planting design. Oops, we have a little spelling error there, but it's place-driven planting design, naturalistic agriculture, nature-inspired gardening, or environmental landscape design. It's the French way to spell design. Very interesting. Nature-inspired gardening wins out, and then we're kind of even for place-driven planting design and environmental landscaping design. Excellent. Thank you for participating and sharing that. Our next step then is we are going to ask each of our panelists, and we're going to start with Katrine to tell us a little bit about what their definition is.
Yes. Hello. Hi. Thank you, Chris. So from my perspective, being an ecologist, a biologist, who later in life started designing landscapes, a lot of the beauty and a lot of the life in a landscape is very, very connected to me. So if I see a landscape with purely exotic or invasive species, then to me that doesn't look good. That looks like just another piece of agriculture where life is not, unfolding. So to me, I'm probably more of a environmental landscape design, I like the nature inspired gardening. I really enjoy that. We usually have this philosophy of we have 4 different things we look at when we design in Vejsnaes, which is our company. And it's concerning the amount of space you use. You have to look at resources for the environment, for nature, not for humans necessarily. You have to look at variation, and then you have to look at time. That's very, very important component to naturalistic or nature designs, if you ask me, because good nature takes time to develop.
I like the idea of time. That's often something people are not patient about.
Yes. It's and it's it's a big frustration sometimes, because you want to put something in the ground and then you just want to see it the next day. But good nature takes a long time.
Excellent, thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, thank you. In many ways, I think I agree with Katrine, but as landscape architect working more or less only in the cities, I also think it's important to have a look at the aesthetic things, more thinking about at how it perform. I know that time, of course, plays a big role, but we are as landscape architects in the cities very dependent on that it's very early on actually work as a landscape. We can't wait years that the trees will be big and at the same time it's very complex to actually make successful plantings in the cities. So I think it's, for me, it's not copy pasting nature into the cities. For me, it's more working with the aesthetic feeling of nature. And I think not taking, I think we will discuss this later on too, but native, non-native discussion is not so important for me. It's more to getting a feeling of wild nature.
So Thomas, you're describing, I think part of what you're sharing is maybe the pressure from your clients. Is it that?
Yeah, of course. It's there's always a pressure when you pay a lot of money for getting something to work, and also the knowledge about that if we only make seed mixes and only plant small trees, I think there's many good things for this doing that, but it's also important actually to have something finished from the beginning, because then people also interact more very early on with the parks or landscapes.
So part of your definition has to include the people and their interaction, not just the nature. And
I think it's important. It's important to understand that we are also part of the nature in that way. It's not us and nature, but it's more we have to mix that together.
Nice, thank you. And then Austin.
Hello. I related more to the place-driven planting design, because I just think it meant to me like the right plant, right place, no matter if it's native or non-native. I just putting the right plant community together, and we have to get people to be driven to these plantings first, and then as people get used to this more wild look, then we can start adding in more wild. And I think as the decades go on, we have so many people to thank for getting these plants into the market and into public spaces already. that it's just going to become more and more wild as this becomes more, there's more awareness of this planting style to people, because people are so used to prim and proper mulch and trimming of bushes and plants.
Thank you. Thank you. Then I think Jens.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Krista. Yeah, I mean, from being a restoration ecologist, but also having a background, some background in landscape architecture, I kind of see both sides, but I definitely am a restoration ecologist, so I lean more towards the ecological side of things, and that's what our clients, you know, that those are the types of projects we work on. And really, we're not under the illusion that we can kind of recreate, you know, these native landscapes that indigenous landscapes that were lost, but we use those as kind of models for us to build our planting designs onto. And so with that in mind, you know, we kind of have the goal of trying to recreate these native plant communities, and, you know, with the goal of biodiversity, sustainability, and reintroducing some of the processes that manage the land, like fire and potentially grazing or other disturbance regimes, and then matching the plants to the existing site conditions as opposed to, you know, importing topsoil and things like that. But aesthetics definitely do matter. So I agree with Thomas too, thinking about pressure not only maybe from your clients to deliver, but even from public or other people that interact with these landscapes. I mean, you do want to see something, so you kind of balance. I think we can still do our job well as a restoration ecologist and also have aesthetics in mind at the same time. And just at the continuing education to the public or the client about what's going on and why this is trending in the right direction or the wrong direction, you know, because the site is constantly being managed, is always part of it as well.
Thank you, Jens. As I'm listening to all four of you, I'm thinking that more of the clients that come to Jens and Katrine are coming because of nature, maybe nature first, and maybe more of the clients coming to Thomas and Austin are coming a little more in between. Is that, would you agree? Would you disagree? Yeah, Katrine?
No, I think actually aesthetics are quite high up with our clients too. Again, as Thomas pointing out, there's a big difference between whether you're working in a very tight city setting, like very urban areas in Denmark, or you're working in the open land with actual wild nature. So it really depends on who the client is. And even though you're working with people in the city, you know, people have different references to what aesthetics are. I'm not one to say that aesthetics are not important, but it's definitely something we work with. But I'd say that we have, as designers, to rethink the species that we're using. Because pretty much a wild garden can be anything. In Japan, a Japanese garden is actually a native species garden, even though it's highly maintained, but it's still native species. And a lot of these native species actually makes a big difference for the insect, for what we're looking at when we're talking about biodiversity, as Jens was mentioning too. So it's not because these things can't be combined. We can think about it. It's more of a matter of what client is it that you want, or what client is it that you have today.
Yes, Austin.
Yeah, I agree. And I think just sometimes setting the client expectations is the biggest thing, because, you know, the buzzwords of native and natural, to them, they don't really even know what that means, but that's what everybody's talking about in the magazines. And so they're like, I want a native garden. And then I talk to them, I'm like, this is what a native garden is, and this is how, you know, we can group them together. And I think, like, I have a lot of clients that have had, you know, seedings done, and then they're like, oh, we were hoping for more groupings, more blocks. And so I always find, like, you know, collaborating with someone like Jens and having, you know, something more with groupings and, you know, kind of a more designed aesthetic towards the house. And then as we get away from the house, going more wild and natural is perfect. And you know, every client is different, but I think that just setting those expectations and being like, okay, like, and showing them pictures, being like, this is, you know, this is what you're expecting, because so many people are not expecting kind of like, you know, onesies of things popping up. They're just wanting kind of that big band of color, and you know, and we can still do that with a mix of natives and non-natives, but just setting those expectations is super important, I think.
As we were preparing for the webinar today, we did have a conversation where we talked about we're talking about clients quite a bit and their expectations, and we talked about differences between maybe between Katrine and Thomas. You can talk about this a little. The tolerance for maybe the tolerance for things being less tidy, at least in Denmark. Can both of you, maybe Thomas, you can talk, and then Katrine can chime in.
I actually, maybe Katrine, you should start if it's okay.
Sure. I'm not sure I agree on the tolerance being higher for a wilder aesthetic, but I'm not sure I can compare with much. But the last couple of years has been a storytelling that if you want to do something for the environment, you want to do something about the local species of insects and birds, of course, then you start with this, called this a mix of seeds, where people put out a mix of seeds and it will haphazardly come up. And we've seen that in many spaces around Denmark. And it's kind of a, you know, it's a quick fix. It's kind of a, it can be done a lot more aesthetically. And usually the client will try that first, and then usually they call someone like us and say, okay, that didn't work for me aesthetically. Could you come and help me out here? And that's what we're seeing now. So it's a good place to start, maybe with this quite wild aesthetic. But then, you know, as time goes by and it becomes less and less, if they don't maintain it, then they usually try something else. And I think that's one thing we have to remember to talk about too: maintenance.
Yes,
because that is the big one. So putting something together, it will only last if you maintain it properly, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
And it seems to me like a lot of our clients, at least, stop me from talking too much, but a lot of our clients are like, yeah, we want a garden, but we don't want to work in it. It has to look very nice 10 months a year, and it has to be good for the climate and the environment. And that's the real difficulty, to sit down and say, well, nature is not self-governing unless you have a bunch of cows running around eating it, or oxens probably, and a horse and a goat. You know, nature is a dynamic place, and you have to go through it, and you have to do stuff to it, but just in different times and in different ways than that we're used to in gardens. So there is this maintenance thing to the aesthetic that I think we need to talk a bit more about.
Very, very well put. And maybe it was me who was saying that I thought I had observed more tolerance in Denmark. But then we have No Mow May that has come up these last couple of years in the US, which is kind of a movement to not mow your turf in the month of May. And that has been, you know, a national thing. And of course has created a lot of controversy. So maybe it's happening everywhere. I think I need to move us on to our next topic, which is to talk a little bit about project successes and challenges. And again, in the spirit of how we wanted to bring this information to you, we didn't want to only bring, like, you know, I think many times you come to a seminar or presentation, and at the end you have an answer like, do this, 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 and all things are solved. But it's never quite so simple. And as we have talked with each other, we realize it's not that simple, and this is still kind of new and exciting, and a process that we and our clients and our industry is learning about. So we did want to talk a little bit about project successes, but also challenges. And I frankly think that some of the challenges are most interesting, because this is where we learn and we develop things that can work more systemically in the future. So we'll start, and I think each of you has a slide or two to talk about. And we start with Jensen.
Yeah, thanks, Krista. Yeah, this is the this is a project I think was emblematic of a lot of the kind of typical issues we deal with on somewhat larger scale, longer term stewardship projects, where maybe the stewardship aspect of the project was not was not emphasized enough from the beginning, because that's kind of where we fell short. But this is the Museum of Danish America in Elkhorn, Iowa. It was a prairie and wetland project as part of about 20 acres of that, part of the larger 30-acre site. This was initially designed, this Krista knows this site well too, but this was originally designed in, we designed it in 2011 and implemented in 2012, which was unfortunate because it was a drought year in the Midwest, most of the Midwest, at least Western Iowa. And most of the initial seedings didn't really take off really that well at first, and was also implemented by a contractor that was not necessarily specialized in this type of implementation. And again, getting back to that stewardship question, like the stewardship was not really begun immediately. I'm not sure where they necessarily got this idea, but kind of the impression was, well, we just put some seeds down and nature will take care of itself. Well,
Jens, can I just interrupt for a second, just because I know we have audience from both continents. You said stewardship, and for us, I think when we're talking about maintaining prairie, we know what that means in North America. But stewardship is maintenance for those.
Yeah. Stewardship is maintenance.
And the other term that I probably should have mentioned earlier was we use the word ecology here, or ecological, in the U.S. and in Denmark, and when you use ecological, it translates to organic, right? So we don't mean it as organic here. We mean, so if we talk about ecology or ecological, we're meaning in relation to a naturally occurring system.
Correct. Yeah. So trying to, again, like we talked about before, trying to recreate an attempt to recreate these plant communities as best we can. That's reasonable. And again, the stewardship or maintenance, we like to use the term stewardship. I guess we kind of use them interchangeably, stewardship and maintenance. But to us, we like to think, being good stewards of the land is part of our mission, kind of part of what we do. So that stewardship was not kind of taking place initially in 2012, and they also didn't have staff on site. Also, this site is fairly remote. It's not really close to many population centers, so having people that are on site to steward it was just not really available. And then, so a few years after that, we kind of, in about 2014, 2015, we got back on site and kind of nursed it back to health. And this was an interesting scenario, because I remember the first visit out there in, a few years after, the director of the museum thought a lot of things looked really good, but Krista and I were walking out there kind of thinking, oh no, this is not looking great. So his impression of all these invasive plants, because some of them had flowers and maybe had some structure, were actually it was actually not trending in the right direction. But despite the drought year and some of the challenges, there were areas of the site that came up pretty well after the drought, and I think some areas the seed was most likely dormant during the dry period and just sort of germinated under the right conditions in subsequent years. And then we kind of formed a committee and got a local contractor to help us with the stewardship, with the guidance of myself, to kind of point them in the right direction for this, stewardship visits during the growing season. And since then, up to date, we've really turned a corner on this site. So we now have a 20+ acre prairie and wetland with kind of a new wetland water control structure that's really pretty diverse. And just taking a cornfield and a bean field and a turfgrass field into kind of this diverse planting has really been a nice turnaround. And I think some of the lessons learned were, again, kind of making sure that stewardship, that we're part of this. This is a landscape we're managing. We are part of nature, and we need to have stewardship on the table from the get-go. Which again, it was always talked about, but maybe not. Maybe it wasn't brought forth enough. And then also just kind of patience in knowing that this process works, that, we've done it before. So maybe the first year we had some bumps in the road, first few years, but eventually, trusting that do know what we're doing, and then the site will respond with the right management. You know, everyone gets a little impatient, even I think people like us in our industry that are used to doing projects over longer time scales, and we want to see them turn around immediately. But we always got to remember that we've been doing this for some time, and I think we have some idea of the process, and to kind of trust that and see it through and make sure we have a plan in place, and then kind of this adaptive management, this dynamic, like what Katrine was saying about that these sites are dynamic, and being able to adjust and adapt to the different site conditions. You know, we have a plan in place how we're going to manage the site, but if the site is reacting differently, we will change. We don't keep doing the same thing if it's not working. So, but this is a good lessons learned. It was challenging and some failures, but also we've turned it around and had success. So I think a lot of sites, there has been other sites like this where maybe the client would have kind of given up and not followed through, but you know, I think sticking with it has definitely paid off, and now this park is a big part of the museum site, and people go to visit it, and it's nice to be a part of it.
Thank you, Jens, and thank you for all your work and collaboration on this. And we have a question from Scott Stewart. Welcome, Scott. It's nice to virtually see you out there. But he's asking about the role of public landscapes to tell the story about and educate the public about balancing ecology and aesthetics in a garden design. And I think he might be thinking more about a little bit more garden designed style than the example that we have here. But I do think that one of the things that, since I have been involved in at least encouraging or twisting Jensen's arm to help us with this, and have observed the change over time, one of the things that made this project different was the engagement of the staff and their openness to learning. And obviously they were the client. So we actually spent several years visiting restored sites and other sites to give examples, so they could know what were we aiming for, because they weren't even informed enough when we started to understand what were we aiming for. But they had a strong commitment to getting to this eventual state of their site. So I think that they had probably extraordinary commitment, and that was encouraging to us. And they had curiosity, and we had public places that we could take them to show examples. So I think that there is a great benefit to having public spaces that are showing a spectrum of examples, whether it's a restoration example or a blended design with some ecology, or the whole spectrum. Thanks, Jens. And I think we're on to Thomas.
Yeah, and I can actually just continue more or less the same as both Jens and Katrine talked about earlier, that of course what I see as some of the biggest challenges in most projects is the first years of maintenance, the establishment of these dynamic landscapes, and also the communication to the public about how they work, and that we can't, especially we can't decide if it have to rain or not rain, or we're having a drought period. So we have to work with these things, and I also see a lot of problems with the contractors work with soils. So we have a lot of problems with either the soils are too compact, or the soils are totally dead, or these things getting actually. It takes some time actually to build up a soil again, and that can make a lot of challenges on the projects. This is just different photos from around different projects. Not saying that picking some projects out, but just showing that it can be challenges with established especially seed mixes. I think that's some of the things where you actually have a very dynamic plant list, and some of the plants you will never, they will never come or grow. And if you go to the next slide, just saying that what I normally see is after some years working with the sites, you get the green feeling or the nature feeling. So it's sometimes it just takes some years. We want to plant a lot of big trees and plant a lot of perennials, but we know that if we have the time, we can manage to get the feelings. We also make these. We work very closely with at SLA with the biologists, so we normally make a monitoring of what kind of local biodiversity is in the area, and after some years we make a monitoring again what have happened for these projects, and we allow, and that's also one of the challenges, I think, that's communicating out, that we allow that some plants is okay that they come. We don't have any weeds, and we just know that some specific species shouldn't be in the site because they can give a lot of problems. But this is a long fight sometimes, both with the clients and with the users of the park. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. I think, I mean, maybe it's just the slice that we've taken, but I think the monitoring part is really, really interesting. And I guess sometimes that probably depends on whether there are monies in a client's budget to do that monitoring. And I don't know, maybe is there more encouragement of that? Like, is there any government requirement in Denmark that might be different from here?
No, there's not in Denmark. There's any requirement. So it's all depends on the clients, of course. But also, I mean, I think it's important in the storytelling about the site, saying that suddenly we have 100 new species in the area, telling that story and telling a story about that. It's not. That is a complex ecosystem that we create in the city. I think that's the reason, and I think a lot of clients actually are willing to be part of that story and pay for that.
Thank you. Austin.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about one of my kind of a failure to a success. I worked with Jensen on this project, Jensen Ecology. They did some seed mixes because this was like a large, like 1,000-acre property for a client's house, and he wanted a 25,000 square foot planted plug meadow. And so we, on the bottom right, you can see we had just finished planting the meadow, and that you know, it seems like it's all good and dandy. And then, you know, the previous year he told us like, oh, I've got this big water tank to water it. We're good to go. And so I thought we were good, and I just trusted him. And this was one of my first bigger projects, private projects. And so I trusted him, and I got there, and it was a water jug on the back of a golf cart. And so I'm like, how are we going to water this whole meadow? And I wanted to do it in spring so that we had some rain showers, but as we've all talked about, there's no such thing as a normal season anymore, so we can't count on normal rainfalls. So we kind of struggled with the watering the first bit, and so we had to drag a 300-foot hose and bring that down. But just things to think about, and then, you know, design. We talk about, you know, blocks versus matrix, you know, so groupings of plants. The groupings were very successful, but where I did matrices and mixed grasses with perennials, we had a huge issue on the left picture here. You can see all the grass coming up. That's an annual crabgrass. And so I didn't realize that was going to be an issue. And Jens did a great job clearing the site and getting it ready for the project. And then all of a sudden this army of crabgrass came up, and I called Roy Diblick, and I'm like, Roy, what do you do? And so the best thing you can do is have a friend to call, because every site is different. Nobody knows what's going to happen on these projects. What is going to come out and scare you, or is it going to be an easy go? Probably not. And so it's just, you know, you never know what's going to come up. And so this grass grew like, I don't even know, like a foot every 3 days or something. And so, you know, I saw it this day, and then Jens was able to come out like 3 days later, and it was already like 3 feet tall. And so like, you know, and then Roy's best advice was, you know, we could, you know, string trim it because it's an annual crabgrass. So that's, you know, the knowledge of your weeds. And so he said, as long as you keep that short, you're able to keep the plants alive and the sunlight coming to the plants, and keep those coming up, and then they'll survive the next year, and then that annual grass will be gone, and then the next year they'll have enough life to take over it. And so you can see the success on the top right, where we had the stewardship, which seems to be a key player in all of our discussions, the importance of maintenance. And so, you know, now with all clients, before a garden even goes in the ground, the maintenance is definitely the first discussion. Is, okay, how much maintenance can you afford? This is how often you need it. And, you know, that is based on how big of a garden that I'm going to put in or design for the house. And so they have that understanding that that the garden needs a future and would have to have maintenance. But you can see the blocks here; those were all put in plugs, and this was just the season later and how full it is with the Monarda and of course mountain mint, Pygnanthemum muticum, and yeah, so it turned out well in the end. And then the successes, I just want to talk about some public projects. So the left here is Kingwood Center Gardens. I did a meadow for them, and I just want to show, this is middle of Ohio, Mansfield, Ohio, and they probably they're not exposed to naturalistic gardens there. And the first day we put it in, some of the higher up staff told me they hated the garden and they didn't understand why we were putting it in. So messy looking, and so it's really, the garden reminded me of Cantini here in the Midwest. It's an annual focused garden, so they're used to like big, high impact color from annuals and tropicals, and they do an amazing job at it. And so putting all these native plants and natural, you know, just things dabbled around, they weren't used to that, and it has become like a big showcase for the garden. And now the people that didn't like it are all coming up to me every day. There's something different. It's so beautiful, and like I absolutely love it. And now all the gardeners, they said they sneak around the corner, and the gardener is just having fun, and she's, you know, prancing through the garden, enjoying it. And then she said everybody else is whipping hoses all over the place and having to water everything, all their annuals and tropicals. And so now all the other gardeners are starting to incorporate more natives and perennials into their gardens. And that's exactly what these gardens do in public spaces, is just inspiring all these homeowners and other gardeners to just kind of be aware and to start blending this with what they also love. You don't have to get rid of your annuals or tropicals, but just incorporate it together and have that awareness. And then the right picture is at Millennium Park. This is in front of the BP Bridge. Scott Stewart hired me for the Millennium Park Foundation to create more naturalistic, artful plantings around the park. This is right next to the Lurie Garden, and the Lurie Garden, of course, had such an impact on Chicago, the Midwest, the world, and is still stunning and amazing. And you can see the reflections from that around the city of Chicago and how people are emulating it, which is awesome. And so Scott Stewart wanted to do that around the rest of the park and have that reflect and get rid of some of these utilitarian areas. And so this used to be lawn and some overgrown shrub that hid the view of this beautiful bridge, pedestrian bridge. So this is a naturalistic design that I made 2 years ago, and just kind of having that space where people can enjoy, and putting these plants on center stage in these public spaces to show people. And then, you know, they might not notice it as they're walking around and not be like, oh, wow, like these plants are really making me feel good today. but they're going to realize they feel different. And when they go to the store, they're going to say like, oh, I remember that garden at Millennium Park, and I want to put some grasses in and some. So it's really great that people like Scott Stewart are forward thinking and putting naturalistic gardens at the front and at a park that has 20 million visitors a year.
Thanks, Austin. I like your comment about it being a reflection for the city and the Chicagoland community. And part of what we are enjoying talking about is these challenging spots. There was a comment, I think, from one of our audience members about no mow May and kind of questioning, is it a good idea? Is it not a good idea? There's some questions from particularly if it makes it difficult to sort of get your turf areas back in shape. And then there was a question about one of our or from one of the audience members about how prevalent lawns are in Denmark. I would say they're still pretty prevalent, although in Denmark you put a hedge around your lawn to make it more private usually. But yes, turf is certainly prevalent and part of the conversation. And I think we could, probably have a whole conversation about turf reduction and what do you replace in that, and like Katrina, your comments about the role of whether it's bison or it's sheep or it's whichever that helps control things that are grasslands and that ecosystem. Our time is going. So I think Katrina has some comments here about challenges and successes with her projects. And then we will soon be wrapping up our hour webinar. And then if you want to stay for those last 15 minutes, we'll try to get to more of the comments and the questions that have been shared. Katrina.
Thank you, Krista. Well, yes, I'm not sure it's going to be much different from what everybody says, because I hear a lot of the same things going on again and again. Thomas mentioning monitoring, really, really important if we want to show progress, if we want to know what is there already, because coming back to this thing I said was one of our big ethics when we design is time. So not just giving it time, but also respecting the time it's taken to get to the point where it is. So an old tree is worth a lot more than a young sapling, and just recognizing the landscape a bit more. Also having baselines to monitor. If we go from turf to something wilder, then we have to have a baseline in some sense to say, okay, we started here, now we're here. So what we are doing is working in some way or another. That's something we spend a lot of time on. And there's some very, very interesting new methods out there, techniques. Environmental DNA is coming out. The terrestrial part of environmental DNA is really, really interesting. That's something we're going to work a lot with this year. So actually taking DNA from plants and soil and everything and establishing what is there and what is coming. We are looking into so if you look at the first picture there, that's actually why I brought this picture, because this is not a failed project. It is just the beginning of a project. And this is going to look so much different this year, next year. But it was also, we were very sure that when we started this project, there was nothing on that site that we could kind of, pardon my French, screw up. We had to make sure that there was nothing there of value for ecology or for different species. So we looked into that, and it looks very barren there. And there's another important point I find when we're talking about these designs is that it's not all about the plants. I'm sorry, A-Plant, I know you're sponsoring this, but it's also about structures. It's also about having a place to live. It's also about having water. All these different things that are resources in a landscape. We have to put this into our designs. We have to think about these things, because if you make a city where that only contains restaurants, nobody wants to live there. And plants are primarily restaurants. They're food, they're places to eat. Few insects will live there, but they're mostly restaurants, right? They're mostly food. So we have to look into, okay, there are places to live, is there places to breed, are there places to have a drink? We have to think about these things in our designs too. And if you look at picture number 2, going across, So this is kind of a situation where we were looking more at, okay, so we have a client they're very stringent. They like their lines and they like everything to be right. So what we did for them was that we focused very much on the negative space when it comes to plants. So we focused on the paths, making this lawn. We cut this lawn into a series of little paths, and they keep them really, really tight and stringent. And that allows for a much more wild look within the garden bed itself. And we could have grass and wildflowers there. And they could be a little bit more dynamic, and it could be a little bit wilder than you would otherwise. But if you look at the front of the bed there, that was a pre-existing garden bed, but it also shows that you could also use a lot of native flowers and native plants as ornamental pieces. You don't have to combine them with long grass. You don't have to have this wild look. You can work with the plant itself, just as you can work with exotics or species that have been bred for many, many years to have a certain quality. We can go back and we can use a lot of these natives. I'm not saying everything, but a lot of them. And by that, we'll take some qualities and some resources and put them into our gardens, and actually give some space back to nature, because it's really bad here in Denmark when it comes to space for nature. It's super bad. I think it's the worst country in the world, if we're just behind Bangladesh or something like that. We have almost no nature left here. Everything is maintained. Everything we have thousands of square kilometers of turf and a lot of agriculture, right? So we have a different setting here. We really, really need space for just a simple insects and birds. Everything is kind of disappearing here. So we have this space issue here that is very important. Yeah. If you look at the bottom two pictures, the one on the left with the tall trees, it was a project where we had to work with this. So we call it the High Line, but it's really not. But it's an old piece of how do you say that, railroad in the very southern part of Denmark, southern Jutland. Not a lot of money in this project, but it was just a beautiful little piece of nature. Once we started looking into it, there was a lot of species there. There was a lot of life there, but nobody ever went and saw it. So pretty much the only thing we did was that we helped construct this path and just told the story, because the nature was there. And of course we made some maintenance stewardship schemes for people who lived it, and it was wildly successful and very cheap, because there was almost no money going into building it. It was pretty much more telling the story and talking about maintenance. And the last one is just, it's just a garden setting that had a more wild aesthetic. And Krista's telling me now that we need to stop. Otherwise, yes. I'll probably would go on.
Thank you. I have one quick question, though. When we look at either the picture on the lower left or upper right, can you very quickly say what is the percentage of plants in those which are native to Denmark?
The top left, the top right one?
Yes.
I'd say this would be a 60-70% native species.
Okay.
The bottom left one is 100% native.
Okay, thank you. I guess we knew that this would end up this way as we were preparing. We said an hour will go so fast. I think the four of you could entertain us with continued conversation for easily another hour, but we are at the close of our time. There are several themes and questions from the audience, so I'm glad we have the extra 15 minutes. And so I invite those of you who can to stay for these extra minutes. So you can continue to enter questions in the Q&A box, and that's what we'll focus on here in the extra time. And I do need to remind you, I have a couple of reminders. That there will be the survey sent out, and that's how you get in the raffle or the drawing for some Nordic plants that we can share in Europe and in North America, as well as some books here. And if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing with Nordic and the Nordic brand, go to the Nordic website, and you can also sign up for the newsletter. And then I want to promote that next year, approximately a year from now, there will be an in-person event sponsored by Nordic in Denmark. So if you've been thinking of traveling to Denmark, or if you are in Denmark, I hope that you will show up for that and sign up on the Nordic website so you can learn about it. So now we'll kind of transition into the overtime section, the extra 15 minutes, which we've already started on. So some of the questions seem to have a bit of a theme about how do you convince people to use native plants or choose biodiversity, a more wilder look, and then when you have the criticism that I think Austin mentioned, how do you respond? Do you respond? Do you not respond? Do you work hard to convince people? And I suppose part of that answer might be who is the client and what is their influence. I think we talked a lot about clients, and if you have a singular client, it can be, you know, an advantage in some ways because you can reach one person or one family. If you have a public client or a city as a client or something, you have to sometimes work to figure out who's the influencer or the you know, who's having the control over the project. So maybe talk a little bit about what do you do, and do you need to convince people to use natives, and then responding to the criticism that you might have. Let's start with Austin.
Sure. Yeah, I just like took it in, and when he said that he didn't like the garden at all, and I just, and I'm very confident that the garden was going to be a nice garden, and I knew that I kind of the palette that I used and everything was for this, kind of moment, and I knew it was the new idea to them, and so I was just like, okay, he's not used to it, and I mean, there's a lot of things like Roy told me to mow my garden down in the winter, and I didn't do it for 10 years because I told my clients to do it because I was scared too. So it's something that you just get used to doing, and you have to, learn and as you go. And I just kind of took it with a grain of salt. And I'm like, okay, we'll see how it goes. Like, we're putting it in, so there's no turning back. But yeah, and then with, things like, yeah, I mean, most people come to me for natural gardens. Nobody really comes for, high stylized English cottage gardens or Italian Renaissance gardens. So I don't really have to push anybody's buttons to try to get them to look, a little more wild. But by going into somebody's house, you can see how like type A personality they are. And if they like things like just so, then I will like make it look a little bit more tighter, or use grasses that are a little bit more tighter, like Cecularia autumnalis versus Sporobolus heterolepsis, or something a little more wild looking. And so just kind of reading into those things is really important to make your clients happy. But just educating them that what you're doing, and that you're going to give them what they want, and to trust in the process.
Katrine, you have an answer here?
Yes, and no, of course, because again, it depends on, every project. It's a good idea to choose your site and your client quite, well, so that you don't, because you can end up in a situation where nobody will like it, no matter what you did. But I think one of the key issues that we have here is, again, as any sale, what is the story? Tell a good story, tell a compelling story, tell a story that touches people, tell them why this is important, tell them why this matters. And coming back to what Thomas has always also said before, monitoring is super important, because then you can keep telling the story year after year after year. So and there'll be different stories for different groups of people. Some people like butterflies, some people like birds, some people like the water insects, or the tadpoles in the spring and stuff. It depends. There's a bunch of different people out there, so tell different stories to different types of people, I'd say.
Yeah, and there's a question here about, is there a formula for helping clients understand percentage of budget that needs to be dedicated to the project depending on the size of the garden? Probably, whether it's the level of ecological gardening, or it's the budget, or it's what are you aiming for, it really is quite important to invest the time to make sure that you're a match with the client, right? And that you're on the same page. I'm wondering, Thomas, you have I think you have bigger projects and maybe more public projects. How does that work
I mean,
in your world?
I would love if I could just pick out my clients all the time. I think that's the biggest problem. Always, also when you're working with the publics, because the publics is not like just one client. It's actually more or less everyone going through the park, and everyone have a comment about these things. So also the client have to are confronted all the time with different opinions, and opinions they have no clue about what's actually the project about. So it's a huge job of to actually communicate out what's going on here, and what's the process, and what's going on. So I think it's, yeah, I think it's difficult to of course all projects are different, and for us, for me, it's sometimes it's also just a success if we actually get something to be like, and it's a public park, to be green in some way, and very green very early. And not just, and then of course there can be different success in what kind of green and all that stuff, but the public parks are difficult, and the clients there are also, that can sometimes also be tough to work with.
Yeah. Katrine.
Can I have a quick follow-up just? I completely agree with Thomas, and sometimes it's hardcore work when we're talking public spaces. But again, there's a difference between choosing a client like a commune, like a municipality, a kommune, who thinks it's a good idea with a naturalistic look or biodiversity, or a commune who just puts the blame back onto the architect or to the consultant, say, oh, but they said to do this, we don't care about it, you know. So that's also what I mean about choosing your client. Choose a client that will back you up, and that will help you tell the story, because our municipalities and our governmental institutions, they will put it out there, and they have giant channels that they can communicate on. So that's just to, follow up a bit.
I'm going to try to, Jens, you have something?
Yeah. Sorry, don't want to drag this out too much, but I did notice there was another question about like volunteers too, and I think like we get a lot of volunteers on our projects. I don't know about the rest of you. I mean, it kind of depends, but volunteers, you don't necessarily give them really intense tasks to do necessarily. Maybe you don't hand them a chainsaw or things like that, but seed collection or other things, and then they can also be very good advocates for you, especially, maybe people that have some standing in the community, because they'll be like, oh, I volunteer out there and it's actually coming along great and things are, so not only can they actually help you get work done and be fun to work with and be involved in a project that you care about, they can also be good advocates for you. So I think that can help.
Yeah. I'm seeing there's so many different topics. It's a little difficult to know which ones, how we pick up, because we could have an hour-long conversation on so many of them. There are some questions about how, I think this is from the European audience, what methods do we have, what tools do we have when we do restoration? And maybe that's a whole other program if people are interested, that to explain what are the restoration methods that we've learned here in North America. But obviously it works in our environment and climate and with our plants. But that could be an interesting conversation. I see a question here from Herman. It's nice to see you out there virtually, Herman, asking about how do we as production nurseries produce the plants that are desired, and understand what is going to be specified by landscape architects and landscape designers with ecology in mind. And I guess I would say I certainly know that challenge. We have to guess. And if it's new things or unique things that there's not high demand for, oftentimes the best way is to have a collaboration with the landscape architects ahead of time so that we can plan something together. And if it's a teamwork is the best, because then we can talk kind of collectively. Sometimes what works in the end garden is different from what we can reliably produce and grow. So I think collaboration on that. There was also a comment about wonderful lawn seed mixes. So I think this probably is from someone in North America who's talking about we can have a naturalistic look, but not using native plants, which we talked a little bit about that last time, and using microclover and options like that. Are there questions, any of you, in these last 3 minutes that you see that you really want to try and answer? Katrine?
No, sorry, it was more about, I have to give a small comment on the naturalistic. I think we just have to bear in mind, I don't have any problem with this design. I think it's really good and it does a lot for aesthetics, and I also do some from ecosystem services, so the value we take out of nature as humans. But we got to be honest in our declarations, right? We got to be honest, and we got to be honest to ourselves too, also what these gardens are doing. So if we're using exotic or species that don't actually give something back to nature, then I think we should, we should be honest about it. Whereas it's much more difficult to maybe design with native species, but you have that extra dimension of, okay, so this is actually adding some value to somebody else than us. It's a bit of a side comment, but we've seen it so much with climate now that we can't say something is good for the climate without it being it. And there's a lot of lawsuits going on now, even PR agencies that are doing something for somebody else who turns out not to be climate safe, friendly, they are being sued. So we have to be careful about the language we use here, I think, and we just have to be honest about, okay, what is it that we do?
Yes, yes. I have not practiced very much landscape architecture in the recent decades of my career, but in the last couple of years, I have done a little private consulting. And I think that part of that becomes the question of do you, and that's more about maybe each of us personally, is my first choice native and something that is giving something back to the environment or biodiversity? And I'm guessing everybody here on the panel and maybe most of our audience, much of our audience, your default is going to lean on that side, that you're going to choose what is beneficial, truly beneficial to the environment, and not just naturalistic looking, but really a native that's bringing some true value to pollinators and environment. But then we deal with the clients and all of their expectations. And so in my recent excursions or experiences, I have clearly, because that's me, started with a conversation about, let's talk about native plants first, and then it becomes an education program, right? Because many typical people doing, let's say, their home landscapes are not thinking about that first. Or I think, as Austin kind of alluded earlier, they've read about it, they've seen it in the magazine, and they like that idea, but they don't really know what they're getting into. So it's so much education, right? But I agree that caution about not saying something that's not true is really important. And now we're at 15 extra minutes. We could go another 15 extra minutes or another hour, but and I think that we have 170 or more people. So we're so excited that you joined us, and please do fill out the surveys. And thank you to all the panelists. It's really a pleasure talking with you. Really exciting to explore some of these ideas, and there's so much more we could discuss. Everyone have a great day as we move into spring. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for joining. Bye.